Okay guys, let's look at giving you some answers to improve your top position with a specific focus for your side control. Now I get asked an awful lot about which side control position is the best and why am I constantly losing my side control position, where should my arms be, where should my legs be, how should I be holding my opponent to the floor. Now what you have to understand is that within Jiu-Jitsu, side control is possibly the most varied position there is. If I just give you an illustration of what I mean, just lower your back for me. Just a touch. So if we just to look at classic pins from judo. Now if you imagine there are 3 ways to win in a judo contest: throw your opponent for ippon, submit them, much in the same way as we do in Jiu-Jitsu, and pin them. The side control or the pin in judo is commonly known as yoko shihogatami, or side 4 quarters hold down. The more traditional yoko shihogatami looks a little bit like this. I would have removed my opponent's frames from the near side. My hand would be under his head, that you commonly use in Jiu-Jitsu as well. I'd be controlling my opponent's upper center. My other hand would now be between his legs, and I would either be grabbing his pants or his belt in order to pin him to the floor. This is the traditional yoko shihogatami. I can change this a little bit to kazure yoko shihogatami. My hand would stay between the legs, but this time my opposite arm would come out from underneath his head, come across and over the top, and hold his arm in this fashion. Okay, so already you can see that there's a couple of variations on one very simple thing. Another one, moon gatami, is where I take my arm out and I'm holding with my legs on one side of him and my arms on the other. Most of you know another variation on the theme for a pin, which again is side control, are your scarf holds. So we have the regular kezegatami, scarf hold, this position where I have control of the near side arm. I'm using my hand like a pillow, attaching to my own leg. My legs can be this way, or they can be in the 90-90 position, and I'll be pinning my opponent in that fashion. A variation on a theme from that is to take my hand out from underneath his head, and again use it as an underhook, much like before. Well, this is kazure kezegatami. Okay, I can change that further by taking his arm across his head and holding him in either this position or belly down to the floor, which would constitute katagatami. You would know that as the head and arm choke. In judo, that's classified as a pin. Okay, so there's what, 5 positions there that we can consider as side control. Okay, if we look at the ones that you potentially understand or would recognize from your jiu-jitsu practice, side control again is where I've taken away his ability to frame on the near side, using my head as a pillow and combining that with an underhook on this side. You can see in this particular example that both of my knees are in close to my opponent's body. A variation of the theme would be to keep one knee against his hip whilst I sprawl out my left leg in this case to pin him. And I can combine that movement of my legs, or that configuration of my legs, by switching my hands here. These are all variations on a theme. And if we're going to look in depth at it, knee on belly, that is essentially a position from the side where we control our opponent. Whether my knee is down on his lower center, his hips, or I ride my shin up to his upper center, his shoulders. These are all variations on a theme, and this is where the confusion sort of exists in which one is best. However, if you are looking to compare all these positions to discover which one is best, you're almost missing the point. The best side control position you can possibly hold has to have 2 properties. It has to be the position that gives you the ability to put the most amount of pressure on your opponent, okay, whilst at the same time giving him the least amount of possible escape routes that he can find. Those are the 2 key components of what your side control needs to be made up from. And if you are sort of trying to find that best position that is just sheer sort of strength and holding your opponent in place, you're missing the point. What you have to understand are the kinds of movements that you're trying to control across the whole spectrum of control from the side. So what we're going to go through now is give you more of a focused approach to side control with some layers to it. And what we'll do is we will separate these kinds of, or these planes of motion that you should expect or you will encounter, that you will have to hold still at various points through the control from this position. Okay? And I'm hoping by the end of it that you will have a bit more of a conceptual understanding of side control as a package rather than a multitude of different positions that you sort of put in a hierarchical sense of which one is the best and which one is the worst. Okay, so we'll start by looking at some very, very simple movement patterns that my training partner is going to use and how we are going to control those kinds of movements. Okay, so the first kind of movement that you are going to encounter when you are being the top player that you must understand how to control are movements front and back, what we would consider through the sagittal plane of motion. So if I go on my back to start with, on my own, the motions we will encounter in this first layer, if you like, are the bridge, the press, and any kind of motion that brings my opponent or my training partner up towards me. The sagittal plane is a plane of movement where you are able to go forward and backwards. Okay, so my opponent's going to find it very, very hard to go backwards away from me purely because the floor is there. They can't go backwards unless they turn on their side and all that sort of stuff, which we will look at combating a little bit later on. But definitely there's going to be movements towards me from the bottom. So there will be combining movements such as the bridge, the press, and if I'm not controlling their upper body in such a manner that is correct, then they will just sit up and push me off. Okay, so what we can do, now you're back, is get our understanding a little bit deeper by having our training partner provide these movements for us. Okay, we talk a lot about the three key ingredients of jiu-jitsu, those being grip, space and posture. And as we go through these various layers of control from the side, you will see that in each case one sort of trumps the other. But the first layer we're going to look at is definitely more a case of you understanding where your base needs to be and spreading your weight evenly, knowing where your weight has to go. And as we move into maybe the next one, there's going to be a little bit more of connection, so it's our grips. The third one is posture maybe, but control of his posture, not my posture. Okay, so if we're going to work this side control, let's say for the first layer of control, and put some kind of movement to it so we can repeat the pattern and understand when we've been successful in controlling him and when we've messed up. One way we can do that is start in a side control position and look to move through side control over on this side, through to north-south and to side control on the other side, and then just make our way back again. If we're able to move in that sort of realm from this side to this side and back again, we could consider that as one complete repetition. And whilst I'm doing that, all I want him to do is move through that sagittal plane by giving me the occasional bridge, pressing with his arms and attempting to sit up. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to start on this side of him, and I've got a couple of sort of stipulations that I must have put in place for me. I'm going to make sure I always have a hand either side of him. This is my base that I'm talking about. I'm not concerned with gripping him and holding him. I just want to know that my hands are in the correct place and I'm using them as and where I need to maintain my base at all times. Okay, I've got to be quite direct with my hand positioning at the same time as knowing where my hands are. I also need to understand that I must always have some kind of connection with my chest on him. Okay, there's going to be some movement from him, and if I'm able to, or if he's able to remove that connection, then that will just increase the scope for him to move further. Okay, so I've got to make sure, or I need to know where my weight is and where it needs to be. All I'm going to do is move around my opponent using the balls of my feet, keeping my knees relatively close to the floor, around and over his head to the opposite side and back again. And what I want him to do is bridge, press, and just generally move in this sort of plane to keep me unbalanced, okay, as I move around. Okay, let's go. So keeping my chest on him, I can go as slow as I want, understanding where my weight needs to be the entire time, and making sure I always have a hand either side of his body. Okay, if you notice, every time I move my body, my hands move first. Okay, we'll do another round. So he's going to start to bridge. I move my hands first. I'm keeping connection with my chest. Okay, I'm holding it down. That's halfway. And you just repeat the process, going exactly the same way until I complete my complete repetition. Okay, so you would notice that throughout that entire motion, there was no movement from him in a lateral sense, moving away from me, in a rotational sense, or turning into me or turning away. It was all directed up and into me. So all I had to do from a learning perspective was understand where my weight needed to be. And if I felt like my base or my weight was being compromised, my hands were there, my feet were there to steady the position and to complete that repetition. Okay, let's add another layer to your understanding of side control. We've just looked at understanding where our weight needs to be in terms of distribution, and to a certain extent how to base ourselves to counter any kind of sporadic movement through that sagittal plane. The second layer is going to be movement through the frontal plane, so lateral from left to right. So if I put myself on the floor again, when someone's holding me on the floor, not only am I sort of bridging and pressing and trying to escape in this fashion, but if someone's trying to control me from the side position, say on this side, then I'm going to use my hands to maybe clear some space, or from a long frame perspective, it would be from my palm to my shoulders, and from a shorter frame, it would be from my elbows to my shoulders. But either way, I'm looking to make some space to move myself away from the person that's holding me down. Now, in this sort of thought process, you're going to have to control the upper center, so the shoulders as my opponent starts to free their head and move away, and also to a certain extent that killing the shrimping motion by when they move their hips away this way. So what I'm trying to do now is combine my ability or understanding of where my weight needs to be through that movement we were practicing a second ago with a little bit more connection now. In the first layer, we said that definitely we have to think about our base. Where should our weight be to counter any movement from our opponent? And on this second one, now we have this more of a connection aspect. We have to understand that the grips now comes into play, right? So if we have him laying on his back, I want him to combine that first movement of bridging, pressing, and attempting to sit up to escape. But now also what I want him to do is try and take his head and his shoulders away from me and try and use his shrimp motion to move his hips away from me. So I'm having to contain him as well as knowing where my weight needs to be. And I'm hoping now that already you can see how organic side control is as a position. It's not, there is one best side control that trumps all the others. Okay, as long as you understand that the two properties that your side control has to have are, it has to be the position that I am able to put the most amount of pressure into my opponent, but at the same time, the position that minimizes the amount of escape routes that he could potentially exploit. This is going to change depending on what kind of movement you're trying to contain. Layer one, we looked at movement through this plane. Now the second layer, we're looking at movement away from me. So we have to connect, okay? I'm going to do exactly the same as I did before, moving from side control on this side, all the way around to the north-south position, so over his head, and to the other side control and back again. That's one complete repetition, okay? So now the resistance from him can be a little bit more. He's combining the movement that we originally did, plus with trying to get away from him. My hands are always going to be either side of him, but now, so that I'm not allowing him to get away, I've got to connect, I've got to pull him. Okay, my hands will move before my feet move, and I'll try my best to maintain this connection with my body and his body, whether that's my chest, my hips, my arms, my legs. I've got to maintain this connection. Let's go. You can already see that my movement slowed a little bit because he is combining that sort of lateral movement. I'm having to use various kind of grips now to ensure that he doesn't get away. Sometimes I'll have a leg out. Sometimes I'll bring both my legs in. I've got to make sure I maintain that connection the entire time. Okay, we'll do it again. Move this way a little bit. Same thing. Let's go. I move my hands first, blocking as many escape routes as I possibly can, all the time, whilst keeping some pressure on him, ensuring that I minimise as many escape routes as I possibly can. So, that's the second layer to your conceptual understanding of side control, okay? Condensing and refining your ability to hold someone as they attempt to move laterally or away from you. Right, let's add a third layer to your understanding now. This, by third layer, this just is another dimension to the movement that I'm trying to control that's elicited from my training partner. So far, the first layer we looked at was defending or containing movement through this plane. So where our opponent was bridging and trying to unsettle us, pressing maybe, or trying to sit up to escape the position. The second one, we combine that kind of motion with lateral movement. So our opponent was trying to free their head away from us, or use the shrimping motion to free their hips. And you could see that I had to, in the first layer, it was more a case of me just understanding where my weight needed to be and think about my base the entire time so I didn't lose the top position. And as we moved into the second layer, we combined that understanding with a little bit more of a connection. So whereas base was our concern in the first layer, second layer we could say it was more sort of grips orientated. We had to connect ourselves. We had to slow the motion down. Well, this third layer, we're going to be looking at some kind of rotational movement from here. So through the horizontal or transverse plane. So we had the sagittal plane, forwards and backwards. We had the lateral plane, which was left and right. And this one is, in a rotational sense, your horizontal, otherwise known as the transverse plane. Very, very often, especially as you go up through the belt, the higher grades don't tend to rely on bridging and definitely not pressing to escape. And to a certain extent, the lateral movement is not used independently. All of these kinds of motions are used in conjunction. So you might see a bridge and a lateral motion combined with some kind of rotation as they come up onto their shoulder. If they're able to turn away, as my guard is getting past, if I'm able to turn away and roll in a rotational sense, I could come up to the turtle position. So this is something now that we have to consider. Okay, so if he lays on his back, we're going to still understand where our weight needs to be to keep some weight on him. That's our base. We have to connect to him to stop him getting away from us in the lateral sense. That's our grips. Now we have to consider what to do when he starts to turn into us this way. So if he starts to look this way, or if he starts to turn, roll and get to the turtle position by moving away from us. Not only do we have to condense our grips even more now, and finding some cloth to sort of hold him flat to the floor, but we have to manipulate his posture in such a sense that he's not able to rotate. So layer 1, we looked at our base, layer 2 was our grips, layer 3 is posture, but more concerned with disrupting his posture. There's always, you should be doing this subconsciously anyway, where I'm always thinking about keeping my hips lower than my shoulders so that I'm projecting my weight through my center of mass as opposed to just holding on to my opponent like this where my hips are higher than my shoulders. Incidentally, if I'm holding someone like this, thinking this is a strong position, this is the position where I'm going to get bowled over because I've been too heavy, too top heavy. My posture was all wrong. Okay, so as I'm moving through this side control exercise now, my posture should always be one where my hips are lower than my shoulders and I'm projecting into my opponent. Okay, so now what I want him to do is combine those first two layers, movement this way, movement away from me, but also turning into me. Okay, so he's going to be combining that shrimp now with maybe rolling away to the turtle position. Okay, so let's go. He can really build up his escapes now. Let's go. So I'm having to really slow down my movements. I'm having to think about where I put my grips and how I control him, keeping his back flat to the floor the entire time. Okay? So I'm moving and I finish my repetition. Let's just move back this way a little bit. So the key component now is not where we grip so much to contain it, but how we use our grips. You have to understand that through this side control position, I'm always trying to keep my opponent flat on his back. He doesn't want to be flat on his back, he wants to turn into me or turn away from him. Well, the mechanisms he uses to do that involve him posting on maybe the near side elbow to roll into me, okay? Or posting, getting that elbow on the far side to the floor to roll away, okay? I have to imagine that we understand he has 4 corners. Shoulder, shoulder, hip, hip on the front. He also has the 4 corners on the back. Hip, hip, shoulder blade, shoulder blade. Keep those flat. How do I do that? Well, think of it like this. Anytime my training partner starts to turn into me, I maybe just lift up this near side elbow. Try and turn into me. If his elbow is off the floor on this side, there's no way he can turn into me efficiently. And by the same token, if he now decides to roll away from me, he needs to get this, he needs to get this far elbow to the floor to roll away. So if I can clear that and keep that off the floor, that's going to make it very, very hard for him. Okay? All the time I'm maybe lifting this far elbow, remember, he's got to get this shoulder off the floor. So to combine, in combination with lifting this elbow off the floor, if I just keep my weight on this elbow, this shoulder here, and he tries to roll away, it's twofold. I'm lifting up and I'm pushing down. Well, the same can be said with the hips. If he starts to turn into me, if I can lift up this near hip, it keeps him flat on his back. And by the same token, if I'm controlling this elbow so he can't get it to the floor and roll away, I just bring this back towards me. And all of these little mechanisms are designed to keep my opponent flat on the back. Okay, so I'm hoping by now that you will see there is no one sort of magic side control position where you can just park yourself on top of your opponent and hope that that will control them indefinitely. It's a complete organic process that involves you imparting the most amount of pressure as you possibly can as you're moving through this whole process, if you like, but at the same time closing off all of the escape routes potentially he can have. So if we run through this one more time, the third layer is rotational movement from him, but I want him to sort of put it all together now. So the bridges, the presses, the sitting up, the lateral sideways movement, and the rotation. Let's go. My objective is to consolidate the position, keep him flat on his back, making sure I know exactly where my weight is, making sure my grip patterns are set. I'm gripping first, then I'm moving. I'm controlling him through his shoulders, through his head, and through his hips. Okay, so that's your sort of third dimension to this side control, if you like, rotational motion. Okay, so the fourth and final layer to your conceptual understanding of side control now. So you could almost say that the first three give you a three-dimensional approach or a 360-degree approach to the position itself. Well, this is the fourth dimension then, the one that we haven't considered yet. So far we've looked at the kinds of movements that we're trying to contain, as opposed to just giving you one specific side control to sort of fixate your attention on and hope for the best. We looked at movement through the sagittal plane, so movement going up in terms of a bridge or a press. There was the frontal plane, so lateral movement where our opponent's trying to get away from us. And the final one we just looked at was through that horizontal or transverse plane where our opponent's trying to rotate, either to roll away and turtle or to turn into us. Okay? Well, the fourth layer then, the fourth dimension, if you like, is how to kill his ability in recovering the guard. He has two ways to escape our side control, either by reversing the position, escaping essentially, or by placing us back in his guard. So we have to understand how to avoid that whilst maintaining the control in every other area. Okay, so now you're back. If we sort of give you, I'll explain what I mean by now. Anytime I go near my training partner's legs, from a top position, I can fall victim to losing the top position. All the hard work of trying to hold it up here, and one silly mistake, I end up back inside his guard. If he has a better guard than I have the ability to pass that guard, I'm going to get swept and submitted all day long. So I should avoid the legs like the plague. Okay? He puts his legs down for me. Let's consider him as a clock. Put your feet down. So at this point, we'll say his head is like 12 o'clock. His legs are 6 o'clock. Just put your arms in for me. And if we were to undo his belt and lay it out to the side, we have 9 o'clock and 3 o'clock. Okay? 12 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 9 o'clock and 3 o'clock. We do not want to go anywhere near 6 o'clock. Taking into consideration the danger as we get closer to the legs, that must include 6, 4 and 5 o'clock, together with 7 and 8 o'clock over this side. Stay away from the legs at all costs. It's easier said than done, especially, put your legs up, whereas we're trying to move to contain all of those other 3 layers of motion that he's given us. There's going to be, every now and again, space on this side over here. As I'm moving around and I'm not thinking clearly enough, I'm going to lose that top position and end up being put back in his guard. So essentially now, I've now lost top position. We must have some kind of understanding in a conceptual sense of how we're going to avoid these legs. So, using the same repetition that we've already done, moving from side control to north-south to side control and back again, we have to have the ability to block his guard recovery. If you remember way back to the beginning, we sort of dispelled the myth about there being a one side control that is better than all others, and that fits every kind of body. That's completely incorrect. We sort of said that the best side control is the one that has 2 very important components. It enables me to put the most amount of pressure into him as I possibly can, whilst at the same time minimizing the amount of escape routes that he can use against me. Okay? As of yet, we've not considered this guard. So what we're going to do, instead of starting on our knees in this side control, we're actually going to drop our hips down to the floor and start in one of those side control positions we discussed at the beginning, that being almost like a modified scarf hold, if you like. Okay? Move back a little bit. So immediately you can see that with my hip on the floor down here and almost pocket to pocket, it's incredibly hard for him to get his guard back underneath. Okay, if he starts to really turn into me here, he still can't get his leg underneath my butt. And remember, we've already talked about the containment of all the moves that he's trying to do. So I'm not just going to sit here with my butt on the floor, pocket to pocket against him. I'm going to be controlling the near side elbow, or I could be controlling his head in this fashion to discourage him from turning towards me. Remember, if he can look towards me, he can turn towards me. If he can look towards me, he can escape away from me with his hips. So we've got to maintain all of these things. Okay? So the first part of the body I'm going to block this guard with are my hips. Okay? So he can't get underneath to recover his guard. The second part of my body I'm going to use is my knee. So as I start to move from this scarf hold and continue on my repetition, I'm going to bring my knee up to block his ability to get his guard back into me. And if you notice, as I move from hip to knee, I actually walk my butt back using the balls of my feet, which immediately points his guard, his weapons, away from me, before I bring my knee into a more conventional side control position. Okay, well, the third part of my body I'm going to use to block his guard retention, after my hips and my knee, is my hand. So from here, the process is this. Before I start my repetition now, I'm going to go hip, knee, hand. If he tries to get his guard back now, you can see my arm is protecting the guard, the attempted guard recovery from him. Plus, I can now use my hand, if I wish, to push his legs away from me as I move away from his hips. And that's exactly what I am going to do now. I continue my motion as we were doing before, round to the north-south position, and I continue round to side control on this side. Well, as I start to approach this side, I've still got to be careful that he doesn't recover guard on here. So as I go towards the guard, I go hand, followed by my knee, so I can take my hand away, and then very quickly I'm going to drop my hips down to the floor on this side. So as a rule of thumb, when you move away from the guard, in this particular example, hip, knee, hand, and as you approach the guard to stop any kind of guard recovery from him, it's going to be the reverse, hand, knee, hip. So if I start to move back in the same way that I came, from here I go hip, knee, hand, I move around that north-south position, and then I go hand, knee, hip. Okay, so if we put this into practice, now I want my training partner, just come back this way a little bit, to put all of these aspects, these movement patterns, if you like, into action. So I want him to move through the sagittal plane, I want some lateral motion from him, I want him to rotate into me, go away from me, and recover his guard. My job is to complete one complete repetition without losing the position through a reversal or by him recovering his guard. Okay. Okay, so with all of that in mind, you can see how now one particular position that we could consider as side control doesn't fit every kind of movement that he's going to be giving back in terms of an escape attempt. So in answer to some of the questions, why am I constantly losing the top position? And remember, we've only looked at side control. We haven't factored in maybe a knee on belly or improving the position even more to mount or back mount as he rolls away. Sometimes you can allow this motion to capitalise on a mistake from him. But you must be able to understand that if you're constantly looking for that one best position for side control, you're asking the wrong question straight away. You're almost doing your jiu-jitsu wrong. You have to understand that there's 4 dimensions that we've just looked at to the kind of motions he's going to be giving me back. So whichever position we do use to control him, it has to be an organic position that controls the movements or combinations of the moves as he gives them to me. Okay? One side control does not fit every circumstance. It's that simple. It must take into consideration 2 extremely important points. The first point is me putting the most amount of pressure possible into my opponent to control any kind of motion, okay? And on the flip side to that, that position must also give him the minimum amount of escape routes possible, okay? Those are the 2 constants that any position that you choose must adhere to, but it's a constantly changing environment, if you like, that you have to control through this sort of layered approach to that one position. Okay, so I hope that's given you a little bit more of an understanding of why you're losing side control or how you can better your side control just by understanding the kinds of motion or movement patterns that your opponent's going to throw back at you. Okay, let me know how you get on with it, and with a bit of luck it would have improved your side control.